What is it with the Toronto Star that they so fervently pursue their own blinkered, self-serving agenda just to sell newspapers? Why is it that almost every day, as self-appointed champions of virtue, they present us with tragic stories of rare, well searched for, subtly presented, and usually very isolated tales trying to prove so-called systemic racism in our city? Today, as an example, there are 2 full pages, including the front page, outlining so-called systemic race hatred in Toronto. If there is ever a severe race problem in Canada or Toronto or Ontario, and I pray that there is not, it would have been inflamed to a great degree by the gutter press constantly provoking racial dissatisfaction and disharmony, by irresponsible journalism. In today's edition, 18th of June, in a typical example, we read a half-page article headlined "Systemic Racism Pervades Police." Let me repeat. Systemic racism pervades police. Look at those words individually to see how cleverly phrased they are to incite and provoke. It does not read occasional examples of. It doesn't read in some areas of policing. Nor does it read some officers, because that, my friends, wouldn't sell enough newspapers. And that, of course, is their intention. But systemic and racism and pervades certainly does. I was under the impression, the mistaken illusion, that incitement to race hatred was a criminal offence in Canada, but not one applicable to the Star, apparently, and all of it, backed up constantly by constant criticism of our so-called fascist police. How many times, and I ask this question sincerely, has anyone listening to this been actively harassed by the police? How many have been treated aggressively? But on the other hand, how many have been treated with courtesy and respect? Firmness, maybe. But our police are not social workers. They are law enforcement officers, upholding Canadian laws and risking their lives on a daily basis to protect our citizens of Canada. We should bow down in awe of our police, rather than condemn them as the Star is so intent on doing. Yes, there are a few bad apples in the police, as with every profession. But it is these men and women in uniform who risk their lives daily and will always be the thin blue line that protects society from barbarism and from the jungle. And yes, there is race prejudice in every society. But the Star's inflammatory examples on a daily basis are cleverly chosen ones and not the rule, a fact which the Star sees to conveniently ignore. What ignites us is fellowship, love, and community, not the disunity which the Star seems to inspire just to sell newspapers. I am sure that the many ethnic groups in our diverse city do not need to be continually reminded that they are victims of so-called white tyranny, because they know that they are not. I know that the Star would be horrified at my saying so. But Toronto is not Detroit. Ontario is not Alabama. And our police are not all card-carrying members of Hitler's Gestapo thugs. What is it with the Toronto Star that, in spite of the sincere efforts of our provincial government in dealing with COVID, they seem bent on making political capital out of a massive human catastrophe. If the Ford government locks us down, they should have done it earlier, or later, or not at all. But always they are criticized for incompetence. And yet, in one recent issue alone, they have the stunning goal to direct the public not to point fingers while blatantly doing so. In that one recent so-called objective article alone, we learn about a lack of political will on behalf of Doug Ford. Willful political incompetence inflamed public opinion against Doug Ford's questionable competence. Hints of political conspiracy by Doug Ford and a panic-stricken premier who failed to provide the resources workers needed for protection. 5 direct and indirect backstabs in one article alone, which craftily tries to prove journalistic objectivity, but which blatantly proves the opposite. In the last couple of days alone in the press, we read in the Toronto Star, we read about Ford's fatuous rhetoric, his clinging to power by muzzling critics, his violations of our fundamental human rights. Wow, now I'm getting really scared, but that's probably the Star's intention. We learn of Ford's intentional blaming of everyone else for his government's disastrous plans to get us through the pandemic. We learn of a man motivated by saving his political future by dictatorial tendencies. Wow, holy cow. Easygoing Ontario this week, and Nazi Germany with stormtroopers next. My advice to the Toronto Star is to get a grip on journalistic responsibility and what it means. All of this while conveniently and consistently ignoring such major Liberal government scandals as the Lavalin SNC affair, conveniently hushed up by the ousting of 2 cabinet ministers, including the Attorney General and a senior aide to the Prime Minister, because they tried to enforce the criminal law of Canada, which was their job. A scandal which makes Doug Ford's minor foibles pale into insignificance. What is it with the Toronto Star that their reporting of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is usually so riddled with subjective anti-Israel bias? The political problems in that area go back for more than a millennium. Both sides have genuine grievances, and both have experienced a pain rooted in age-old bitterness. But if it is to be solved, it must be done objectively, and not with the kind of subjective emotions which are inflamed by the blinkered vision of media opportunists like the Star. What is it with the Star that they seem intent on violating the basic rule of journalism, which is to tell the objective truth, and not to be smitten by their own subjective anti-conservative, anti-Israel bias, just to sell newspapers? In the last election, the hopes of Stephen Harper, an effective and visionary Prime Minister, for re-election, were destroyed totally by a consistent, virulent, and almost excessive campaign of belittlement, more worthy of a newspaper owned by a third world fascist dictatorship. A campaign which successfully destroyed his campaign for re-election. If you don't believe me, look at the Toronto Star newspapers for the 3 weeks preceding the November 2015 election for an example of so-called objective reporting, and then shudder with shame at how low our media sank in protection of its own personal agenda. How crass the Toronto Star has become and how irresponsibly they continue to violate the principles of objective reporting. Shame on you.